Welcome back to Sylvester's Customs. Today we're doing a hands-on block sanding tutorial on this 67 Nova's deck lid. This video is geared towards beginners tackling bodywork. We'll answer common questions about block sanding your panels to perfection, like which sanding block to use, what grit to start and finish with, how to know when to stop sanding, and a lot more. By the end, you'll know how to get a classic car panel dead flat and ready for paint. Let's get started.
In this part of the video, we're going to go over choosing the correct block for the panel that you're blocking, more referably to the thickness. This is a next level block, and it is an acrylic block with a 1/2 inch thick acrylic piece and a foam top as the handle. Now, you're not going to be using a 1/2 inch thick block to try and block something that has a very slight curve, because at that point, you're just going to be rocking in the center of the block, and the block is not actually doing its job. I like these blocks because they are very low profile, and because they're an acrylic block, it's going to show you everything that you need. As you step down in thickness, obviously that is a direct reflection of a more curvature that you have on the panel. The block is going to be more flexible. And then down to a 1/4 inch thick, which is probably one of the more common blocks that you're going to use. But if you're using too flimsy of a block versus too thick of a block, instead of the right block that fits that panel, you're going to get very different view as to what is flat. We have excessively guide coded the back of this car that hopefully that will help show up more on video for you guys at home. These blocks need to be used in a manner that we always use the thumb test. The thumb test is just placing the thickest block for the size and placing with your thumbs to feel how firm. The problem is, how do I show you guys how much is too much when pushing on the block? You just want a very light pressure for the block to become contacting the entire surface of the panel you're working on. 1/2 inch feels slightly too rigid for this trunk, even though it is a very flat trunk on this 67 Nova. Now, if I go down to the 3/16, it just fits perfect. We're not having something that is too thin, where if we use 1/4 inch and we do that with it, it just flips right to the panel immediately. You don't feel any pressure back in the other direction. So we want to pick a 3/16 block for doing this particular panel. Now that we've narrowed down the thickness of the block for the curvature, we need to pick the size of the block. Now, all we did with this next level block was we just chopped it in half with the skill saw. That way we could fit into, whether it's a big area or it's a shorter front extension of a fender, and it's just to create the best flatness that we can get. If we were to use this short block to block the majority of this trunk, it is not going to be bridging any high or low points. At that point, this is just floating along too big of an area. You only want to be using a block that fits that area. For example, you may not use this small block for the center section, but you would use the longer one here to keep a nice consistent pattern, and this is going to overlap those areas. However, when you move into a tighter radius, the thing that I find is that everybody does good on the big open areas. It's these reverse curves going around a catwalk of a rear window where you may need specialty blocks that fit a contour. This block, although it is a hard block, it has a double radius on either end. That way you're not digging gouges into that reverse curve. This is going to allow you to then walk slowly around a curvature and blend. But then when you get to the very end here, this block is too long for that curvature. So then the question is, well, what do? Do you cut this block down? No, because this block is too rigid. You're constantly going to be balancing thickness for length. And if you can do that accurately, you are using a larger area that is flat for a longer block, more rigid. When you get to a tighter area around the reverse curve, we have specialty blocks like this that Next Level sells, where this is about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch thick, and it is more narrower. Well, if it is more narrower, we can then fit in here and get this block to curve in all different areas. We will touch later in this segment on techniques on how we use these blocks as we roll from one shape to another, blending. But it is very important that you understand that thickness and length is a direct reflection for what curvature the panel that you are working on at that moment. Let's talk about the grits and what paper. Because depending on what you're sanding, I may not like that particular paper or that grit. My go-to currently is Sunmite is the brand. And this particular primer is a primer surfacer. It is a polyester. It is a Evercoat Super Build 4:1. That is a very robust, thick polyester primer. And when you're cutting that down, a lot of people think that we only use 80 grit or 120 grit in the rough-in stage of body filler. This car has already gotten, I would say, 75% of all the body work done. But what we're doing in this stage is we are trying to get one nice, perfect, uniform surface so we can iron out any more details that we may see. But in doing so, a lot of TDS sheets, a technical data sheet, will tell you that after you have primed with a primer surfacer, you need to come back in with a 180 grit or finer. But in a show car, really world-class finish, you need something that's so aggressive that when you come in, you cut it dead flat. The grits that we typically use are 80 grit, 120 grit, 150 grit, and 220 grit for the majority of your body work. Now we use those grits specifically, and it's a rotating scale that basically you need to come in aggressive, because if we are building the mils up, let's call it 20 mils of polyester primer on top of this car, and you have a lot of orange peel, that gun that puts that primer down is like a cannon. It is a 2.5 SATA gun that lays that down, extremely nice, orange peeled texture, and that's what you want. You're not looking for a nice smooth surface when you're using a surfacer. You're looking for build so that way you can iron it back out. Perfect. And the goal is that you land right where you want to be without excessive breakthroughs. So in order to do that, we want to come back in over polyester with anything from 100 grit to 120 grit, not 180 grit. The reason that we're doing that is because we're getting a more accurate finish, cutting it flat, instead of actually using 180 grit to try to iron out all this work. You don't want to leave the car in excessive polyester primer. You want to cut it down to where you have minimal there, and you're always watching what is developing. So we're going to dive deep into the techniques and things that we're going to be doing next. But when it comes to the sandpaper, there's a lot of little key nuances that go into that. Are you listening to what the paper is doing? Do you hear it cutting? Is it worn out already? How long does paper last? That directly is dependent on, are you using the right block on the curvature, or are you using it too aggressively to where the paper is wearing out faster? Are you hitting metal areas? Is that wearing the paper out faster? Also, what are you visually seeing? Is the polyester still powdering up nice and consistently and evenly? Or are you noticing that maybe the paper has clogged areas where it's worn out, and maybe that product was too wet and it's just not doing what you want? You want it to always be gliding with light pressure, cutting aggressively enough to get through that. So if we paint the picture of we got 20 mils, we really built this up, we're gonna typically come back with 120 grit, probably the majority of the time. I would even go as far as 100 grit if Sunmite actually sold it. But because we don't have that, we use 120 grit and we just start cutting it down because that's gonna do it aggressive enough that we can see things powder. Paying attention to, is it cutting? Can we hear it? And often I will even rip off a little piece and stick it on the corner when I'm teaching people this technique so they can get used to feeling the block. Give yourself a few swipes, feel the bottom of the block. Where your hands are is typically where that paper is going to wear out the fastest, and we want to pay close attention to when it starts to wear out, you are no longer cutting things even and flat. At that point, you have areas of the block that are now worn out and areas that are cutting more, and you end up with inconsistencies. So keeping the paper fresh is key. It might cost $70, $80 for a roll of paper, but what is your time in redoing this? Let's dive deep into technique, because I think a lot of guys just sand to sand. There's no rhyme to reason. A friend of mine, Jason Kilmer, who has preached making every pass count. I live by that today in everything that we do. From grinders to sanding, every pass needs to count. Technique, hands evenly spaced. Now, if you're using a longer block, hands evenly spaced on the block for even pressure. Don't let these block companies sell you some block that's 48 inches long, thinking that the idea there is that the longer the block, the straighter the panel. You've only got two hands, unless you're an octopus doing body work.
Hi, folks.
And if you got a smaller block, you need to be spacing your fingers evenly in the block and always pivoting. It does not matter what block you have, what size you have, you're just using the block in that area. Now, when it comes to blocking down an area, I would say that the thought there is people are always paying attention to the wrong side of the fence. Meaning, as we block with even pressure along the panel, now also note, wear a dust mask. This is extremely bad for your health, but I can't talk to you guys and explain this, so read between the lines. We want to be blocking the panel. Now, we've only skipped over this just a couple swipes, and right out of the gate, you can see that fast how the guy that painted the car actually tracked. Meaning, did he spray the car this way? Did he spray the car up and down, front to back? And in this case, we sprayed it front to back. You can see the lines. Those are the exact patterns of his spray pattern. And obviously you can see here and here the most. A majority of people, when they're blocking, they focus on the low area and they end up working those areas too much. You want to be thinking of it like skiing. If you're going down a hill and you're focusing on don't hit the tree, you're going to hit the tree. If you focused on staying on the path, you're likely going to stay on the path.
Stay on the path! You hear me? Don't wander!
Here, we want to be focusing on the high points and always keeping our hands and block over the highest points. So if I'm just going to give you guys a demonstration of this area. Now, if you're blocking this in the whole car form, you need to be blocking the whole area slowly but surely. Meaning, nice and even, nice and slow. So that way you can see what is developing as you go. And constantly checking your block. You can see the areas that build up. What these are caused from is the guide coat. When you are putting aerosol guide coat over, now we use two different types of guide coat. We use aerosol guide coat for the initial. Does not matter if it's polyester, does not matter if it's urethane or epoxy-based primers. When you put a guide coat over the very beginning, that has that surface that is slick, or you need to get that down to where it's powdery, just like when you do filler work. It will plug right out of the gate until you get through the majority of that guide coat. Once we've gotten through the surface, we're then going to switch gears to a powdered guide coat, which is Mirka brand, and we're going to use that throughout the remainder until we respray. So here, these can cause inconsistencies in what we have. Now, because we're just in the very beginning, we're going to work it a little bit farther, but I'm going to check, and I can see that I have areas that are like skis, and they're not going to be sanding, they're just gliding. I'm going to move my hands farther out, and now I'm going to use the fresh paper just to kind of see what else we got. The other thing I would like to mention is when you move across the panel evenly, you want to be using your whole body, your whole torso to slowly come through. Essentially, you're dancing. Now, I don't dance, but I dance with cars apparently. So work slowly through that area as you go, ironing it out like an ironing board. Because if you don't, and we're just here the whole time, this side of the car is lower than this side. And what we're looking for with a long light is a mirror reflection. Now, you cannot use polyester primer to see your mirror reflection, so we are relying on guide coat. The old school way of using your hand and feeling, the level of bodywork, we're way beyond that. You're never ever going to feel it with your hand. We're talking about the most minuscule ripples down to the thickness of a sheet of paper or less. I mean, barely there. I use a dedicated broom for only body work. It's not to be used on the floor to get oils. Also notice I have nitrile gloves, so we're not taking oils from our skin and implementing it into the cars. This is going to help keep a lot of the dust down in your shop instead of constantly using the air and putting it into the air so you're breathing it. You're just sweeping it to the floor so you can get what you need to see. This is scratch tracking, where you're actually tracking what is showing up. We can see that if I evaluate this whole panel, these 2-3 areas are the highest point of this trunk. Well, I need to start at the highest mountain range and bring that down first. The whole time you block the car or the panel, you need to be focusing on blocking the highest points first, not focusing on the low area, trying to get it to clean up. Because then you're going to build all kinds of waves in the car. Focus on those high points and move outward from there. Now, you guys saw that didn't last but even a couple minutes and it was clogging. The more that you get through these layers, the more it's not going to be clogging. So just keep changing your paper out so you're always cutting. There's a lot of little dumb things with when you're swapping out paper, you end up with ripples in your paper that didn't quite stick down flat. Just hold one edge, pull it up, make sure you don't have any air in between, pull it tight, and then basically roll through, do the worm, and get it down stuck nice. Now focus in those areas that are the highest points. And we want to be watching the whole time. Now you can see I've get to a point where I'm just boogieing through because I'm so used to seeing certain areas that are high. But if you know your high points here and here, then my hands need to correlate that. You can do a combination of short strokes or long blocks. The goal is that we iron out the areas that are excessively high first. And as we become more flush, we can then do a longer pattern. So if this is 120 grit, it's just used to cut down the mountain range. You don't want to take down a mountain range with a shovel. We want to take it down with an excavator. That's a bigger grit. Knock it all down close. When you come back with powdered guide coat after everything is close, then you're using a longer motion. Then I'm spending more time going back and forth over the whole thing. Because even though I may only spend 10 passes right here, we're making things inconsistent. So we're trying to get back to that baseline. And when you spray polyester, if you start and stop in random areas, that is excessively higher rather than treating. I would say that you need to treat polyester primer like it's a candy paint job, meaning all the way through the panel, all the way the length of the car. Don't do individual panels. All of our cars get sprayed together in the body stage. It isn't until they're painted do they come apart. And also, when we have areas that are a transition into a reverse curve and a corner like this, this is where we want to use something like a double radius block, because this squared up block is going to cut a groove in here and we want this to glide through. So we'll use the 3/8 block out here in the open area, and then we'll constantly be switching back and forth to 120 grit, same grit, different block. Just need to kind of press it down. They don't stick the greatest, but they will start to conform to the block. And then here, now when you roll into these curvatures, we can see that right now it looks as if the catwalk is slightly higher than the trunk. So we want to focus our X pattern across both panels. We're constantly blending. And again, I'm paying attention to those clogged areas. We need to then sweep our area, put new paper on. You're going to go through more paper in the very beginning. We can see that this is the highest point. So we're going to keep our hands over the highest point until it starts to even out. So that may require a shorter stroke right here. Also notice I'm not staying directly parallel with the edge. I'm slightly kicking it. That way I'm ironing out. It would be like the analogy of driving over a speed bump with a block that you want to cut it flat. If you move over the speed bump doesn't get cut out. But if you slightly kick it, you are then tracking over the speed bump, cutting the high point out. We want to cut the high point out in the polyester. And we also don't want to be pushing so hard that we have the trunk that's deflecting and we have a catwalk that is fixed. We want to use a light pressure, let the grit do the work and the block do the work. We're just putting it down firm, not excessively hard. We've only used a few seconds of blocking here and I'm already on the third piece of sandpaper. And a lot of people think that that doesn't matter, but it really does. There's another factor in that is when we get to an area that you can't reach with two hands, a lot of people want to go to one hand blocking. And although that is a technique, I suppose, I don't recommend it, especially when you're learning, because it's creating bad habits where now your only pressure point is in the center and it is pushing in. The rule of thumb is that if you have low areas that are larger, you do not want to put your hand into that low area if it's bigger than your fist. Here, you can see that everything is tracking, and those little high points where the gun tracked, as those iron out, we have this very tight pattern of guide coat showing. The goal is that we bring that all down evenly. As soon as you switch your pressure point to one hand, and in some cases that may be your only option, but if I do have to use one hand, I will do it in an area with a little bit more experience, and I will use a lighter touch because I don't want to carve a hole down in the catwalk. I want to try to do this evenly. A lot of times we'll climb in the car, crawl out the window, hang over, and then block that area so we can go all the way one side to the other, moving back and forth. However, here, we're just trying to get you guys to see how you stay in an area. If this is all the high point here, this is where we're going to focus. We're listening, we can hear it cutting, we can see it powdering. It's not a ski, and look at how much more even it's becoming. As that high point comes down, this will all start to track more. You are watching the shape develop. As it starts to track all the way through, you need to be moving with the block down the panel. Once everything is blocked out and there's no guide coat, well, you just did inconsistencies just to get that orange peel out to begin with. So you start that process every time you have to upgrade to the next grit and guide coat in between every single grit. There's a couple other small things. I don't know if this shows up right here where we have a different color. We actually found this by mistake. What happened was we started out with Evercoat Super Build 4:1, and we went through a gallon and we ran out. I thought I had another gallon, but it ended up being Finish Sand 4:1. So same manufacturer. The TDS sheet says they're compatible. You can then spray that wet on top of one another. But what is it physically doing to do that? Ironically, Super Build is slightly a different color than the Finish Sand. And so what it's doing is it's giving you visuals as you get down, what kind of mill thickness do you actually have left before we start seeing filler or before we start seeing bare metal. It's just a good tool. We use guide coat for doing the same thing, but now I can see because I know that the Finish Sand was a very light coat and it took a bit of work right here, and now I can see the Super Build below. Just kind of different things you guys can play with. I don't know that it shows up on video, the sound, but when you come in with an area that's already through the guide coat and you hear it, it sounds nice and fresh. Program yourself to be listening for that fresh scratch. Now that this is starting to track through here, we have the tighter radius that goes around this catwalk corner. You have a few different options. This block obviously is not going to fit there. It just rocks back and forth. So as we see that this block is too rigid and too long, you would think that we need something similar to this, but in fact, We need something very different to be able to create this sweep. Because this curvature is so tight, we are actually going to switch gears to a next level block that is only, don't quote me, I think it's an 1/8, might even be a 1/16. But because it's narrower and we've cut it down, now it has the ability to fit into this radius. But it does have a squared edge, not a radiused edge like the block we were using. So how do you avoid cutting in? It all boils down to blending. We are watching this develop into being flat to here for this block. We're making a mental note as we go because that's going to be repeated through the grits that we upgrade to. But we need to blend. So if we know we're going to use this block and it's not near as rigid, but we use even pressure, very light pressure, and we just lightly block, you do what I almost call like a windshield wiper. You have one area that is smaller and you have one side that is longer. So you have to work in this area blending. Well, check it out. Even with a very light touch and a block that's super flimsy, I can locate areas that are high points. These we want to focus on ironing out. And it's going to be a combination of working back and forth. Well, I can use this out here on the flat. So I need to get as much of this area flat first before I start doing tie-ins and tracking with this very thin block. Here, it's also nice sometimes if you don't want to have a groove that you treat the block almost like a file and you work from the radius outward, and sometimes you'll work from the outward into the radius. We do not care about body lines at this stage. We care about body lines after we have got everything 95% done, and then we're going to come back in and create those. There's also a transition period here where we're using the radius of the edge of the block, so we're slightly tilted. And then as we come out onto the flat, we're holding the block back flatter. We're still doing a 30-degree pattern parallel with the area that we're working. This is curved, this is straight. We're going to stay straight, X pattern. Here, we're doing the same thing, but essentially we're following the curve. Here, we can see our high point. We're not going to focus on our low point. We don't even know that this is a low point. But in order to block something accurately, we have to make over here that's flatter and easier perfect first. Same thing goes for over here. We don't really work the tie-in until these have already been perfected. Work one shape at a time and just keep moving around. The more that you can keep moving around an area, the flatter and the straighter your car is going to be. You do not want to just stay focused in one area. We do that in the stages when we're in filler work. Here, we're just trying to tie everything in. So if you got 10 different spreads in the body filler stage, polyester stage is tying all of those 10 together. That's why you don't want to prime very short-handed. You want to prime the whole area all as one. There is a little bit of short strokes, and we can use the same block, but because our hands are in a different place, we can slowly start to turn the corner as things develop flat. Don't think that this side of the block over here, where my hands are not, are doing any damage. All they're doing is just lightly rubbing. They're not taking any material down, so you don't have to worry. I think a lot of people block things and they think that if they move over here on the block, this is causing all kinds of lows, and it's actually not the case. Your hands are only blocking the car down right where they are, and that is why it is a gimmick to sell you a block that is longer than, call it 28 inches. It'd probably be about the max that I would use, because you don't have enough surface area with pressure points. I could make a car perfect, guide coat the whole area, and block a couple passes and show you that your hands are the only area that block is tracking, even with a 1/2 inch thick block. It does not matter. If it doesn't feel right, it's not right. The goal here is to get you guys tracking flat. You can see how this is all tracking in one. And as this starts to curve around, although this may look low, you have to work these areas first. That's going to slowly close in here. And once we have this down to a minimal curve, then we switch to this nice, close tracking block that we really lightly feather in. And that's where we feather this radius out into the open. And then when you go to the next grit, the areas that you inconsistently sanded with this show up in the guide coat out here. And it's this balancing act back and forth until you make this sweep perfect. Remember I talked about the rule of thumb is that if we have an area that is low, we do not put our hands there. We want to focus on these areas. So if we have this block here, we're going to keep our finger points out here on the areas that are hitting. And you can see this is cleaning up really nicely. You can see a little bit of inconsistencies here and a little bit right here. But if we know we're hitting here, we can now put our fingers there and start to bridge these things. This hand is typically just kind of guiding the block. It's not really pushing much, just barely, fingertip pressure. This takes a bit of finesse. But you can see as I barely block this down, this all starts to clean up. We want to save this little area for last, work all this down until we get there. And then constantly go back and forth between other blocks evenly. And transitions into the trunk. We can see that this is a high point. It's just starting to touch here. So now we're going to focus my hand not to go in here where this is, but my pressure point here to go between the two. And you can see that this is starting to scratch through the center ever so slightly. And we'll go back the other direction. As simple of a shape as this is, it can be complex for the beginner, and that's what we want to do. You can also see the big difference in color between super build and finished sand. And I'm also paying attention. I can hear the change. It starts to wear out, starts to plug. This is also why you would not want to start with 180 grit. It would plug this paper so fast, you would be more frustrated than actually conquering it. So constantly, I will also, because I don't like necessarily 120, sometimes when I have this much mills built, I might even go back to 80 grit to just buzz it down. And when things start to see close, I'll guide coat it with powder and then go to 120 grit. This is still the high point, starting to clean up. The old windshield wiper comes out. Back to the flat. Back up here. Notice, this is still showing guide. If you watched my hands and even rewind this, my hands do not go in here. They go around it. As you see or feel the block to wear out, switch, move. But this is still the high point that I need to bring down. Now, we are officially to a point where everything on this panel is tracking pretty decent. This is not filler, this is still polyester. We can then start to use this block accurately, because if you're using such a flimsy block, you have to slow your roll and really go slow to feather things out. Anywhere I see low, I'm just going to continue not to put my fingers in those areas, and they will slowly start to develop. We want to show you guys what is too much sanding, what are the cons of that. If you can keep everything with polyester showing on the back of the car like we just showed you, that is ideal. That is likely not the case you're going to have, especially if this is your first time and you don't have a lot of experience with bodywork. Likely, and you're going to find this to be very minimal compared to what you guys are probably going to find. That's part of the process. What you're actually looking at here, not only do we have the different color primers, but right here in the center of the hood is actually the light sprayable guide coat that is still showing, meaning the whole hood has been blocked out to a point where we have filler showing, which is, it's not ideal, but you're going to have it. Our goal with this car was to block it all out. There's so many body lines in it that we just wanted to get things to about the 90 percentile point so we could fine tune the last little bit, create the body lines to be crisp, and then put a thinner version of polyester over the top to just perfect things. So when you come across areas of, how do I know when I got to refill, or when did I sand too far? What you're looking for is your baseline. Well, you did your body work over epoxy primer that was black. That's what we did with this car. Why? So we could see it very clear and early. Well, that's what this black is showing right here. It's a couple swipes from being through the epoxy, but that is only epoxy, not bare metal. So it had to get worked down. Polyester filler started showing, but it wasn't cleaning up. They kept blocking it. Now here we are, we got epoxy, and that is our absolute. We do not want to go past there, because as it is, we cannot put sealer and paint over the body filler. I mean, I guess you could, it's not going to look good. Even though they're both polyester, the polyester filler is going to absorb the sealer more than the polyester primer, and you're going to have rings and dieback where it's soaked up into the filler more. It's more porous. So if we know we're going to reprime, we've established that that's what our goal was. When we find areas of guide coat still showing, like we have right here in the center of this hood line, I want to then bring in a little bit more filler to just perfect it. But a lot of guys go south in this stage because we're adding filler back over the top of polyester. Well, what if you've upgraded grits and you're already to 220 grit and you've got to come back here in one spot and add filler? We're going to be using our paper by hand. We're not using a block here because we don't care. We are just trying to scuff only the area that is low. Now, if you're in 220 grit, filler does not like to stick to 220 grit. So I would recommend that whatever you're scratching the area that you're going to add filler, you're between 80 and 120 is ideal. 150 is pushing it. And then blow it off. You're going to reapply your filler just beyond barely of your pencil marks. Make sure your pencil mark is there. And if you need to mark around your pencil mark on what is good, what that is actually going to show you is as you work through the filler, blocking it, those areas start to blend and the pencil shows up when you're back at baseline. So you're not creating lows over here. Well, when you block this, let's pretend you've added filler right back in this area. We can still use this block. But if we know our low is only here, our hands or our fingers need to remain right here. Even though this block may be 24 inches long, we're only utilizing this small section. When it starts to blend, when you start to see pencil, that is where you can come in, and if you have anything left, which here we do not, the goal is that you have enough poly left that you can feather those things out. So if you have any areas or any dings that you've missed, take care of them early before you start seeing the transition through the polyester to filler or to epoxy. That is the goal, is to always maintain that baseline that you did in body filler. So you know, if you start blocking in the beginning and you start see high points or low points, initially, they're always going to be the high points. Those are what are going to always show up first. So you got to bring everything up, block it even, and if you see it, that is your indicator that you have to stop. Once you have it ironed out, you're just going to continue to go through that process of upgrading in grits. Now, if you're going to only spot prime, let's just pretend everything's perfect and all we have is a couple little areas of body filler showing, but we want to go to sealer. I can then take a product like Slick Sand or Finish Sand from Evercoat, and I can just blend. Remember we talked about not priming only here, but if we're using a product that's slightly thinner than Super Build's so thick you can't just spot prime. You're going to end up with this area that looks like filler added, and it's become harder to blend out. We only want to use it to cover these areas of polyester filler and do this process of blending in those areas that you have spot primed and upgrading grits, making sure that that is flat. We are going to take care of all the body lines, any small inconsistencies like this one, and when everything is at least to 150 grit to 180 grit, we're going to go back around this car with likely Finish Sand or Slick Sand to just lock in any of those areas and do that exact process all over again. And the goal is that we end around 400 grit dry to where we can then seal the car in a urethane sealer, or if you optional want to use an epoxy based sealer, but at least at that point, you can then go higher in grits. You cannot wet sand polyester primer or polyester filler because it is porous. The porosity of those products will wick in and soak in moistures. We want to keep things dry. We don't want to be using spray aerosols, not even wax and grease remover, in my opinion. Can it be done? Yes, but you have to let it gas off. I steer clear of that stuff. I keep things clean. I keep things dry. And if you're in a garage that's small and confined, just cover the car and keep it clean. I hope these techniques have helped you through this process, so that way you don't keep creating this battle. If you're still having trouble, maybe it's time you connect with us here at the shop and come down for a one-on-one class with a small group of individuals who will dial in your car to create a show finish in your garage. Till next time, see you guys around.